Alright, so today I want to introduce you to the nuclear spinner ball python. The nuclear and the spinner are both common names for two gene combinations. So the nuclear is the combination of the fire and the butter, and the spinner is the combination of the pinstripe and the spider. And if you actually work them together all in the same snake, you get kind of an interesting visual effect. Essentially you get one gene from each combination working together. You get the butter interacting with the spider to give you kind of, I guess you'd call it a butter bee. And it's kind of interesting when you work butter with spider. A lot of times it'll strip away all the color and you end up with kind of an axanthic looking snake, which can be really visually dominant between the butter and the spider and kind of overwhelm all the other genes in the combination. It's kind of an interesting project. So today I want to jump over the internet and I want to show you the potential of the nuclear spinner ball python. Alright, so I'm going to jump over here at Morphmarket.com and I want to start with the two genes that make up the nuclear. And one of those genes is the butter. This is what a butter looks like. As a matter of fact, if you actually handed me the snake, I would say that is a pretty good looking lesser. It looks almost exactly like a lesser. And kind of the interesting thing between the butter and the lesser, I actually did a comparison video on those and it seems like in some cases the butters can be a little bit brighter and in some cases the lessers can be a little bit darker than the butters. And you can actually find a lot of butters that look exactly like lessers, and there's quite a bit of overlap. And kind of the interesting thing about these common names, when we're talking about the nuclear, it seems like it's always the butter version of the combination. So you actually have the butter and the fire, which they call the nuclear. If you actually come over here and do a search for lesser and fire, they never really use the term nuclear on that combination, even though the lesser is pretty much almost exactly the same as the butter. I thought it was kind of interesting in some of these genes. They have the sharp divisions in the common names and then a lot of overlap in the visual appearance. So this is what the butter looks like, and if you actually mix the butter with the fire, you get the nuclear, and this is what the fire looks like. And the fire is a pretty interesting gene. It's essentially considered to be a lightening gene. So you work it in a lot of combinations, and a lot of times it can really lighten the background and the color of the snake. And I would consider it to be kind of a gene that cleans up a lot of your bright combinations. So if you make some really super flashy snakes with like pastels and orange dreams and the really bright genes, and you actually add in fire, a lot of times it'll really clean out the pixelation and really enhance the brightness, which is kind of interesting. So if you actually take the fire and work it in with the butter, this is what happens. You get the nuclear, which is a pretty amazing combination. Essentially what it looks like is it looks like a butter that's kind of faded out from the fire. Kind of an interesting effect. Sometimes they can be pretty bright, and I'd say pretty much on average they're a little bit faded out like this. Kind of looks like kind of a really light creamy looking butter, like a creamy butter, I guess you could say. The kind of interesting names over here. It's like someone was in the kitchen picking out all the names for these combinations. So I want to show you the two genes that make up the spinner. The spinner is a pretty interesting combination. One of those genes is one of my favorites, and that is the pinstripe. And one of the things I really like about the pinstripe is there's no genetic defects. There's, you know, no head wobble or kinking. It's been around for a really long time, and there's the prices are really inexpensive, and sometimes these pinstripes can be really super bright gold, almost like a metallic gold. Like this one, you can see this is a really super gold one, pretty amazing. And if you actually take the pinstripe and you work it with the spider, that's where you get the spinner. And here's a spider. The spider is kind of interesting too, because a lot of times the spiders can be really bright gold too. Probably the two brightest gold snakes. And essentially what the spider does is it has kind of the spiderweb pattern right down the top of the snake, and a lot of times it'll actually have a lot of white coming up the sides of the spider. I'd say the amount of white in the spiders really varies. Sometimes you can have a lot of white and sometimes you can have almost zero white, and pretty much from what I've seen, I don't think you can really line breed for the high white or the low white. It's just kind of a random thing. And on the spiders, a lot of times you have this really crazy head pattern. Pretty much guarantees that you have a spider if you see this really crazy head stamp in your combinations. So here's what happens if you take the spider and you work it in with the pinstripe to get the spinner. Take a look at this. Essentially what it looks like, in a lot of cases, it looks like a pinstripe. Really bright gold, even brighter in some cases than a pinstripe. It's pretty amazing. And you can actually see up on the top, a lot of times the pinstripe will have like this stripe right down the top, and the spider really kind of breaks it up into all these little squiggly squiggly lines right on top of the snake. And you can definitely tell the spider's in there from the high white coming up on the sides. I absolutely love the spinner. It's pretty awesome. So if you actually take the spinner, which is the combination of the pinstripe and the spider, and you work it in with the nuclear, this is what you get. You get a nuclear spinner. Take a look at this. It looks completely different than the nuclear or the spinner. That's a completely different visual effect. In a lot of cases, it almost looks like it's an axanthic. The axanthic gene, essentially what it does is it strips out most of your color and kind of leaves you with kind of like a black and white and gray snake. And a lot of times on this one, it strips away a lot of the color, it leaves a little bit of this kind of the reddish color as far as the pattern on here, and really reduces it. And essentially what's really going on, if you actually take a look at all the genes in the nuclear spinner, there's a whole bunch of them. So essentially the nuclear is the combination of the butter and the fire. So you have these two genes in the nuclear, and then the spinner is the pinstripe and the spider. And when they come together, you actually get an interaction between the spider and the butter, which is kind of an interesting effect on those two. Essentially, this almost looks exactly like a butter bee, the combination of the butter and the spider. It's really visually dominant. I actually did a video on the butter bee, and it's kind of interesting. A lot of times if someone hands me a snake that looks like this, you can almost always tell that it's a butter bee plus something else in the mix, and it really takes away, you know, all the visual dominance of the gold color from the pinstripe and the spider, which is kind of interesting. So we can actually work some other genes into the nuclear spinner so you can really see how visually dominant it is and kind of how challenging it is to work other genes into it. And this is the Orange Dream. The Orange Dream is a really awesome gene. As a matter of fact, it's one of the brightening genes. You can actually add this to pastel or fire and you get some really, you can add some yellow belly and get some really bright and flashy snakes. And the Orange Dream can kind of trick you in some cases. A lot of times it'll really reduce the pattern to where it almost looks like there is Enchi in the mix, really reducing the pattern. And sometimes if you actually look on the belly of the Orange Dreams, it can have really strong belly tracks on either side of the belly that look pretty much exactly like het pied markers. But usually with the Orange Dream, it's kind of interesting if you actually look at the belly tracks that I didn't actually pull up a picture. Usually with the het pied, you have, almost looks like someone took a Sharpie and drew a line on either side of the belly, usually about a third of the way up for the het pied markers. And with the Orange Dream, a lot of times those lines will actually continue pretty much along the whole belly of the snake, which is kind of interesting. So a lot of times you can actually pick up an Orange Dream or see an Orange Dream combination, and you think maybe there's Enchi in there, maybe it's het pied, when in fact it's all just characteristics of the Orange Dream gene, which is pretty interesting. So here's what happens if you add Orange Dream to the nuclear spinner. Take a look at this. This is pretty amazing. The nuclear spinner really dominates the visual appearance of the Orange Dream. You can definitely tell the Orange Dream's in there because it's really reducing the pattern even more. The Orange Dream can really reduce patterns in a lot of combos, and you can see just a little bit of the yellow color from the Orange Dream just barely trying to come out. This, you know, the combination between the butter and the spider, the butter bee combinations are really visually dominant and can really overwhelm some of your combinations. So here's an interesting combination. I actually found a nuclear spinner with the combination of Enchi and cinnamon in the mix. And the cinnamon is a really dark gene. As a matter of fact, in this Enchi cinnamon, you can see it has a really dark background. And then the Enchi, a lot of times, it'll reduce the pattern in some combinations. Sometimes, you know, with certain combinations, the Enchi doesn't really reduce it that much. But a lot of times, the Enchi will bring out a lot of your yellows and gold colors in your combinations. So you have a really dark snake with a lot of colors, and you actually take the Enchi cinnamon and you work it into the nuclear spinner. Take a look at this. This is pretty interesting. It almost barely shines through from the nuclear spinner. And let me tell you, when you actually have the butter bee in the mix, it can be really visually dominant. And on this one, it's kind of hard to tell all the different genes in here unless you have a really keen eye. If you actually look at how many genes are in here, there's actually 6 different genes. So a lot of times you produce a snake like this and you're like, you know, I bred all these, what in the world is this snake based on all my genes? And sometimes you just have to sit down and figure it out. And usually if someone's breeding some snakes and I see the combination of butter and spider in either one of those snakes, or as a matter of fact, if you actually took a butter spider and bred it to something else, you could reproduce it. So it could be in either one parent or both parents, the butter and the spider. And if you end up with kind of a white snake, kind of an axanthic looking snake, you pretty much know that you have butter bee in the mix. And then from the inchy, you can kind of tell, you have some of the yellow, and then the cinnamon's darkening it a little bit, and then the fire is lightening it. Sometimes it's kind of hard, unless you've actually, worked on some of these projects, especially if you have like a whole clutch of hatchlings and you can put them all side by side and you're used to seeing what some of the combinations look like. And then you add one more gene and then you're like, oh yeah, this must be this one because we have all these other snakes that look this way. It's almost like the process of elimination when you have a whole bunch of different snakes all from the same clutch. Sometimes it's a little bit easier. So take a look at this. This is kind of interesting. You can actually take the nuclear spinner and breed it to a fire, and the fire is actually in the black-eyed leucistic complex. So you can actually end up with a super fire, 2 copies of the fire gene. So if you're actually working with a nuclear spinner, you might want to avoid the breeding it to anything with fire, because essentially what happens is you get the white snake, and the white snake completely eliminates the visual appearance of all the other genes in the combination. And let me tell you, when it comes to white snakes, I think the super fire is one of my favorites. It's a completely white snake with black eyes, and a lot of times you'll get a little spots of yellow right down the back. I've actually seen some that are completely white, and I've seen some that have quite a bit of yellow. As a matter of fact, I pulled one more up over here. Take a look at this one. I found this one. I couldn't believe I was actually looking for super fires over here, and it seems like this year a whole bunch of people produced a whole bunch of super fires, and some of them are really amazing. Take a look at this one. It almost looks like almost looks like a goldfish or something like this, with this crazy colored pattern on the top, like a koi or something like that. It's pretty amazing. It's like the fish version of ball pythons is the koi, and some of these are pretty inexpensive. I'd say most of the super fires are right around, well, it's kind of hard to quote on prices because they're always changing, but pretty much when I started in ball pythons, the super fires were always like anywhere from about 300 to 500, and they've been pretty much holding steady for the last few years. And it seems like they're, when you start producing some of these ones with a really high yellow, it's pretty amazing. So this one could potentially be the nuclear spinner with the super fire. And a lot of times the super fire, as a matter of fact, I actually looked through all the different super fires over here at Morphmarket, and I couldn't find a single one that had any gene breakthrough the super fire. The only one that I could find was a super fire albino, and when you actually work albino into the super fire, you get an all-white snake with a little bit of yellow with bright red eyes. It's the only thing that changes with the super fire. Alright, so it is time for the question of the day, and Darian Thompson asks, what is your opinion on boa constrictors? And that is a very good question. And let me tell you, I am mostly just a ball python guy. I know ball pythons in and out, but when it comes to boas, I know just a little bit of information, just enough to be dangerous, I guess. I actually did one boa video, and I compared the different localities of boas. I know some of them can get really big depending on where they come from. And as far as the genes, I just know a few genes from talking to some of the local guys here at the reptile shows that specialize in boas. And I've actually been thinking about getting a boa. Probably the one that I would get is a super fire. A super fire boa has 2 copies of the fire gene. It's an all-white boa constrictor, which is kind of interesting. But the problem is they're really super expensive. I actually just went over and looked at the super fires, and they're still pretty much the same price as they were several years ago, anywhere from $4,000 to about $6,000 a piece, which is kind of crazy. Talking about, throwing down some cash trying to breed some super fires. But I think it would be it'd be kind of neat just to get a female and just kind of sit on it. And I know boas, sometimes they can be a little bit more difficult to breed. I've known people that have, tried to breed boas, and let me tell you, sometimes you're spending more money on food than you actually make with your boa constrictors because of how hard it is to actually breed them sometimes. So that is pretty much it. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video.